Argy, thanks so much for the chance to be here today for this conversation.
Thanks.
I really appreciate it. It is close to, it's about 85 degrees or so now. I saw 90 degrees on the thermometer on the way up.
Wow.
But again, thanks. Could you begin by introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Argy Nestor, and I am an educator and presently doing some consulting work.
Okay. And an arts educator.
Absolutely, an arts educator.
And an artist.
Absolutely.
Let's spread this out a little bit. And when we go back, and in our conversation before we began this conversation, when I look across the state of Maine, your voice has been active and widespread around the arts across the state of Maine. When the MLTI began, what was your work then?
I was teaching at the D.R. Gall Middle School in Union, and I was teaching art to 7th and 8th graders. And interestingly enough, D.R. Gall Middle School no longer exists, and it was relatively new at that point, but as districts go, they combined middle schools, and so that's why the middle school no longer exists. I was very excited when MLTI came along because I could sense the excitement, and I love opportunities to learn, and thought this is not just a learning opportunity for me, but it's for everybody. And then to learn that it was required that we have professional development before we get our laptops was, I would say, brilliant, because my staff that I was working with, teacher staff, 7th grade team and an 8th grade team, all went together to a summer middle level institute at Orono.
Yep.
This is when Ed Brzee was coordinator, and there were hundreds of people that would come to this summer institute.
Yep.
And the room was chock full of people needing to learn. And I looked across the room, and it wasn't just arts teachers, it was all content and all middle school. And I was more excited then because what it did in my mind was it evened the playing field. We were all in this together, and we were going to support each other through the learning. And as we learned, we would share it, and it just grew and built on that. And looking at that almost immediately, within a year after that, I realized that nothing in and I had been teaching for about 25 years at that point. Nothing in my career had impacted education on such a broad scope. And I know there was lots of conversation about why would we give machines to middle school students? Young adolescents won't take care of them. I mean, all of those pieces.
Concerns.
Yes. And I was so excited because I thought, absolutely, their minds are open. They're willing to experiment. They're willing to challenge themselves and each other. For the most part, they don't mind looking silly and don't mind taking a risk. I mean, that's part of the young adolescent mind, is that risk taking. So it's great.
The arrival of the MLTI, you've mentioned everybody in the room together, and it did arrive. There had to have been in your school, as we know there were there were some people like yourself who said, oh my goodness, learning opportunity, even if you weren't highly technical before that.
No, but I will say that my school had a set of computers on a cart.
Okay.
And there was thirst for that learning, certainly from me, but some of my colleagues as well. And when those carts came in, it moved me from the front of the classroom to the side. And I began to watch and realize these guys are quick learners. I need to learn from them. So that was maybe a year before MLTI, and we did a project with a program called GOO, and we had cameras. The students took portraits and they loaded their portraits into the computer and then used GOO and make abstract portraits. And because there were only 10, they were sitting side by side, and one was the driver, the other was the artist. There was communication and
they were
collaboration,
talking about art,
and talking about the tools,
yeah.
and talking about creativity, and talking about and feeling really comfortable, because it wasn't the pressure of I have to know how to draw. It removed that piece and supported them as learners, as artists and learners.
Thinking about design,
Mm-hmm.
color, etc. Were there misgivings on your part, a tension between digital engagement with a digital tool, a piece of hardware, and the art room, the brushes, the looms, the potter's wheel?
I would say only because I saw students for 9 weeks at that point. And the next year, after MLTI started, I began to see students for 18 weeks. So in 9 weeks, it was 5 days a week, or maybe it was 4 days a week, but it wasn't only once a week for the school year.
Right.
You have a snow day, you miss them. It wasn't that. But it was every day. And that, in 9 weeks, how do you decide what needs to be in the curriculum? What is the priority?
Yeah.
What's critical to teach?
And what tools most effectively support that learning? What experience?
And so something like GOO, and that was the steps before elements, and then it just grew from there. So the tools became more and more similar to a paintbrush or to a pencil. I mean, it was all there. And there were a lot of students that then began to select which they were more comfortable with, which they could excel in, and which they needed to use to stretch themselves. So it gave them another option to learn through and about.
So in terms of student voice and choice, your classroom and your advocacy was not for a lockstep adoption of a single modality.
Right.
But again, what you've got me thinking about is that we're talking about shapes. We're talking about what impact does the angle of a line do to a work.
And there are 5 artists that are working with line through a time period. Right there.
So the access, the ability to use the device not only as a tool of creation with GOO, but to be able to, you all of a sudden, and again, you were in the mid-coast, so a trip down to the Portland Museum of Art is out. But so you leveraged that.
We had the Farnsworth in our backyard.
You had the Farnsworth, but you had far more now.
Exactly. And, another example, we took this, about 95% of what I did connected with other content. So integration was at the heart of, and sometimes, almost always, the arts were equal in that. And sometimes the arts, or visual art, drove that topic or that lesson or that unit. And we took our students at the end of the year to the place down in Saco. Anyway, we went down there and we had digital cameras, and every student had to have their hand on a digital camera that day, and they had to take pictures of where they saw patterns, where they saw lines, where they saw shapes, and it could have been in the structure of a ride, it could have been in the patterns on the walkway. I mean, it was up to them, and they had to do it in pairs, so they were communicating and collaborating on which pictures they were going to take.
Mm-hmm.
They had to return each with 5 pictures they had taken. We get back to school, we dump those pictures into the computers, and I think that's when they used Elements, and then had to abstract those images. And then it was the end of the school year. They had to write a piece about who they were as young adolescents at the end of their 2 years in middle school. We printed them out on fabric and made a quilt, and it hung in the school. It was their gift to the school. And they also then had an individual one, because they did 2, that they could keep. And so that was that connection of writing.
Well, and part of that challenge, I would imagine, you say they all came back with 5, and we know one of the challenges with the digital camera is you come back with 500, but part of the lesson, or part of the learning experience, is to come back with 5, not 500, which causes that reflective process, that thinking.
And they were not, I remember, before they took them off the camera, they had to delete more than 5, if they had more than 5.
Oh, I can only imagine.
And they're sharing the camera with several other students, so those kind of learning opportunities happened as well, that were different than a traditional art classroom.
You've mentioned the professional learning and the MLTI. Again, you took on a leadership role within. Could you speak about the overall, the way the professional learning was done? It very certainly that some of that initial professional learning was, here's how the machine works, but then there was a lot of open-ended, we're going to talk about it, and it's going to be good because people are going to share. Could you talk about your experience both as a participant and as a leader?
Yeah, and maybe you remember, was seed happening simultaneously?
Yes.
Okay, so part of it was that Carol Waldron and I worked together, and we were selected as a team. So the seed professional development, and then Betty Manchester invited me to be the teacher leader for the arts for the region, I guess it was.
Yep.
And again, like nothing else had impacted education, the quality of the professional development was really high. It was, if I remember correctly, taught by educators who understood how teachers learn and were there to support when there were frustrating moments. And it was about creating lessons and units that were then put out for others to borrow in their classrooms, adapt or adopt in their own classrooms. When did we do that before that time?
Yeah.
I mean, it was amazing.
Well, that seed model, Jennifer
Van
Duzen's work, and the technology focus on it just before the MLTI. That was when you and Carol were some of the seed developers.
Right.
There were developers and adapters.
Right.
But certainly that idea into the professional learning that went on. Some of the seed folks did some of the earliest out of the box into your lap type stuff. But at the same time, and in the conversation with Duke Albanese, who commissioner at that point, as the MLTI was spinning up, the pressure came down for standards. And so the importance of those lessons being validated, that they had, it wasn't, let's just think of a way to use these devices.
Right. Right.
It was asking people to really think.
Mm-hmm. And the arts were included in that standards movement in Maine. And so, again, it was equal footing and thinking about where the integration of technology as
Right.
a tool
Right.
would support the standards.
Right.
It
Yeah.
was right there together.
The idea of the integration, your experience in your middle school as you became the teacher leader for the arts in the region and started to reach out or facilitate some of the professional learning. How'd you go about encouraging others? Because that wasn't the case. There were, and I'm sure there still are, a lot of schools where the art teacher teaches art,
Yeah.
and I teach social studies. How do you, and then the technology is here as well. How have you, starting with the arrival of the MLTI, which delivered that ubiquitous access, how have you tried to encourage the stitching together of those three pieces?
My sister and I were active in 4-H growing up, and we used to use the term, nothing is so contagious as enthusiasm.
Yeah, yeah,
And I find that when somebody gets excited about something, I want to see what's going on. I want to be part of that synergy and
yeah.
excitement. And if it's going to impact a student in my classroom, that makes it even sweeter.
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm not doing what's in the best interest of every student in the state of Maine, when I've done my work over the years, when I left the classroom and went to work at the Department of Education and the Maine Arts Commission, that's my driving question. What is in the best interest of kids? And if I sit down with you and you're a stranger and you have different beliefs about technology or art education, and I share work that my students have done where technology has been a tool, part of that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not the only tool,
Right.
but if you're a lifelong learner, you're interested in what other people have to say. And certainly there are those who aren't necessarily lifelong learners and want to do what they learned when they were in middle
Yeah.
school or whatever. But I think the enthusiasm piece goes a long way.
The enthusiasm, and I hear you also speaking to that foundational, is it good for the kids? Did you see, when you look back at the start of the MLTI, the people who were advocating, because I mean, Angus was up, you listened to some of the Saturday morning radio, he'd be on the radio and people would call up and say rude things about this crazy idea. He continued to advocate. Seymour Papert wrote editorials to the Bangor Daily News that were joked about his advocacy for changing the state from vacation land to the learning state.
I loved it when he said, sorry to interrupt,
No.
but I loved it when he said, when it was suggested that there be a laptop for every 5 students, and his response was, would you give 1 pencil to 5 students?
Right.
And that's simple, it's understandable. Of course you wouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So did your sense, as it came to be, and as Apple, a corporation, became a partner with the state of Maine, so the Department of Education, Betty Manchester leading the MLTI team specifically, and the schools across the state of Maine, did the project keep the focus on the kids, all those players?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And through my lens, I definitely saw that, and I wouldn't have been part of it if it wasn't. So that was first and foremost to me, and clearly was there. Or, like I said, I would not have continued to be part of it. My son was in 6th grade, and in seventh grade. He was going into seventh grade the first year, and there was a offering at Orono that's children and their parents, a child and their parent could come and do this institute. I don't remember, 4 days, maybe 5 days.
Yeah.
And he was with students and I was with the parents. And that was, I mean, I don't know whose idea that was, but it was unique, and I'm not sure I've seen anything like that since.
Huh. Do you remember who facilitated it?
I do. Sean Walsh's wife, I don't remember her name,
Okay.
along with a professor who's no longer at Orono. What was his name? I can't pull that out.
Oh, was it the English teacher?
He was tall.
Okay.
He was a technology person.
Oh, Jim Chiavachi?
Yeah. He's not still there.
No.
Yeah. And maybe it was his idea. Maybe it was her idea.
Yeah.
Sean had passed away at that point.
Right.
And she was a student, maybe of Jim's, and she had a child who was same age, and Nicholas, my son, and she carried on during the time period. And it was
what an
really
interesting
good.
model.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
The and that was it. It was an innovation that was ubiquitous. It just appeared, that there was no opt-out. I suppose there was, but it gained a momentum and was distributed across the state.
And we talk often about, I mean, not all educators believe this, but it's about the relationship with each individual students as well as a class. This tool gave us a different pathway to that relationship building that nothing else had provided up until that point in my career.
Yeah.
So the relationship was still that critical at the center of.
Yeah. All teaching and learning is relationship based.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not and it's not about the technology.
No.
It is the
No, and it's not about the arts. It's about that relationship.
Right.
And,
right. And proximity and caring enough to see the child. The MLTI was that earth-shaking, ubiquitous innovation. It was clear everything had changed. Generations of I'm the teacher, I know it, sit down, shut up, and pay attention, and you'll know what I know. And overnight, literally, that changed.
When we started the Maine Arts Leadership Initiative, Maine Arts Assessment Initiative, MAAI, in 2011, I was at the Department of Ed, and we invited teachers to be teacher leaders. So part of my experience and opportunities as a teacher leader, then I used that as a model and turned that around and said, if we bring them together and they receive professional development in assessment and leadership and technology and creativity, and then they go out there and they create a workshop from what they've learned.
Yep.
They go out there across the state and share that regionally, so that regional model, that they will then be
They'll stay connected.
sharing, and often the arts teachers are islands in their schools.
Yep.
So they're getting off their islands and realizing that their island is larger than they think it is, and build that collegialism around those ideas and that learning and that sharing, and then the excitement of that, and then the next year more teachers came forward to apply to be teacher leaders. And so that model.
And the veterans who had been there with you before
they
stayed on board.
We had 18 the first year and said, okay, this is great, it was successful, here's the areas we need to work on and build out, and and we were going to turn around and put the call out, and the first phase of teacher leaders said, no, we're coming back. We're not like walking away from this. And 16 of the 18 came back the second year. And
Wonderful.
then it just built from there. When I left the department, I took it to the Maine Arts Commission, and that's when we added teaching artist leaders to break down those walls
Yeah.
and go into the community.
Yeah.
And because learning doesn't just take place at school, we know. And then, and those teaching artists have something to offer too. Oh my gosh! And when I left the Maine Arts Commission in 2019, we had 120 teacher leaders and teaching artist leaders.
In a human network,
And-
connected to each other, where a shout for help would be answered. An answer could come from Kittery or Fort Kent.
And I remember the first year we had a teacher leader in Freeport and a teacher leader in Washington County. Ooh, I can picture that teacher. Can't recall her school, but Washington County. They had designed a lesson, and they would deliver that lesson on the same morning. They would come together, using Skype or something at lunchtime, talk about what they had each experienced, what the feedback from the students were. In the afternoon, they would go and do the lesson again and come together at the end of the day.
Wow.
And they would have never known each other, probably.
Right.
They were
Right.
music teachers.
So other innovations will come. I mean, that we know that. What advice, if we were to look forward, might you give to the teachers, the educators, the education community, leaders, whoever, the next time an innovation, a big one, rolls around?
I think if people open their hearts and their minds to learning and are lifelong learners, that's has to be at the heart, and to be willing to take a chance, and it's okay that it's going to be a challenge, and knowing that you won't be alone, that there'll be people next to you that are scared. And we want our students, our learners, to take risks, and we need to model that as educators and as leaders in schools and as administrators. And administrators need to be willing to let go of control if they're that type of leader, and let teachers lead and ask questions and contribute, because everybody has something to offer. And digging deep down inside, sometimes it takes that and matching that up with a new innovation, it could change everything that goes on in a classroom.
Keeping the focus on the kids, as you mentioned earlier, and I love where you began, an open heart and an open mind, and a commitment to being a lifelong learner.
Mm.
Argy, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jim.
For
This
the
has been fun.
chance to be in this beautiful space for this conversation. Thanks.
Thanks.